I can still hear Richard's voice in my head. Family, Hollie. They're the ones you can always count on. He said it every time I worried, every time life threw us a curveball. It was a comforting thought, something I clung to long after he was gone. But as I sat at the dining table, staring at the ledger in front of me, the silence in the house felt oppressive. Richard's words felt like a distant echo, something I wanted to believe, but now, I wasn't so sure. The numbers blurred in front of my eyes. $570,000. Gone. My hand hovered over the pages, the old ink smudging slightly beneath my touch. This was supposed to be my future, our future, once. The life Richard and I had sacrificed so much to build. And now, all that was left was a shadow of what once was, barely $20,000 sitting in that account. The room spun, the weight of the realization pulling me under. How had I let this happen? How could everything we saved be gone, just like that? I fumbled for the phone, my hands trembling as I dialed Paul's number. He answered on the first ring. Mom? What's wrong? His voice was immediate, full of concern. Paul, I whispered, choking back the panic rising in my throat. Something's wrong. The savings. It's all gone. Almost everything. I don't know what happened. A heavy silence settled on the line for a moment. I could picture Paul now, brow furrowed, mind working fast. Are you sure? Did you make any withdrawals recently? No. My voice cracked, my grip tightening on the receiver. Not since your father. Not since he passed. I'm coming over. Don't touch anything until I get there. Paul arrived in what felt like no time at all, his presence filling the room with a calm authority that both comforted and frightened me. He looked just like his father, tall, steady, dependable. But his eyes were sharp, assessing the situation before I could even explain. Mom. He placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder as he sat beside me. Show me. I slid the ledger across the table, unable to speak. The sight of those missing funds was like a punch to the gut every time I saw it. Paul's face darkened as he flipped through the pages. This much money doesn't just vanish. Have you noticed anything strange? Any suspicious charges? No, I said quietly. Everything seemed fine. Until Steve and Deborah moved out. Paul's hand stilled, his gaze flicking up to meet mine. A flicker of suspicion crossed his face. Did you give them any money when they left? Guilt washed over me. Just $3,000. For moving expenses. Paul's jaw tightened, his voice low and measured. Mom, are you sure that's all? I hesitated. Deborah mentioned the costs. But I didn't offer more. At least, I don't think I did. His frustration was palpable. Let's check the security cameras. The footage played out on the screen, the stillness of the room broken only by the clicking of Paul's laptop. My heart pounded as we watched Steve carrying boxes, Deborah lingering by the door. There. Paul froze the frame. Deborah, at my bedroom door, slipping inside. Moments later, she reappeared, holding something small. I felt my chest tighten. The passbook. She took it. The truth settled over me like a storm. The betrayal hit hard, an icy dagger lodged deep in my heart. I couldn't breathe. She took it, Mom. It's her. I covered my mouth, tears filling my eyes. Deborah, the woman I trusted as family, had stolen from me. How could Steve let this happen? The thought was unbearable. I need to talk to Steve, I whispered, my voice barely holding together. Mom, we need to call the police. Not yet. My voice wavered. I need to hear it from him. Maybe. Maybe he doesn't know. Steve arrived looking like a man already broken. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, as if he hadn't slept in days. When I told him what we had discovered, his world crumbled before me. Deborah wouldn't. She couldn't do that. His voice faltered, disbelief warring with the evidence. She did. Paul's voice was cold. It's on camera. Steve collapsed into the chair, his hands shaking. I didn't know. I swear, Mom, I didn't know. Tears fell from his eyes as he looked up at me, his face twisted in anguish. "I'll fix this. Please, don't go to the police. Let me handle it." In that moment, I realized that no matter how much I loved him, no matter how much I wanted to believe him, things would never be the same. The days after discovering the missing money blurred together, a fog of disbelief and anger. Steve stayed at his own place, trying to mend the fractures with Deborah. Paul was my anchor, checking in on me daily, ensuring I wasn't alone. But no amount of company could dull the ache of betrayal. My daughter-in-law had stolen everything Richard and I had worked for. And my son, my Steve, was caught in the storm between loyalty and the truth. Paul and I sat again at the dining table, the very spot where the nightmare had begun. The room seemed to hold its breath, thick with tension neither of us could voice. "Mom, you can't keep waiting," Paul's voice, soft but unyielding, broke the silence. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, his eyes piercing through the fog I tried to hide behind. "Steve isn't going to fix this. You know that, right?" I stared down at my tea, the steam rising in fragile spirals. My hands shook around the cup, but I couldn't bring myself to let go. "He needs more time," I whispered, though the words felt hollow, a fragile lie I couldn't stop telling myself. Time wouldn't change anything. I was clinging to the hope that if I waited long enough, this nightmare might dissolve. Paul exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "Mom, Steve isn't in control here. Deborah is. And if you think she's going to give that money back, you're fooling yourself." His words cut deep because they were true. Deborah had never cared about anyone but herself. I had seen it, ignored it, for Steve's sake. But I'd been too soft. Too willing to believe in family, even when the truth was staring me in the face. "I don't want to lose him," I muttered, the knot in my stomach tightening. "You won't lose Steve," Paul said, his voice gentler now, but still resolute. "But you've already lost too much, Mom. You've got to protect yourself." I swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "What do we do now?" Paul's face hardened. "We go to the police." The thought was suffocating. Once we made that call, there would be no turning back. It felt like I was signing away the hope of ever mending my family. But what choice did I have? The money was gone, and so was any hope of a quiet life. "Okay," I said, my voice cracking. "Let's go to the police." The drive to the station felt endless. The weight of what I was about to do pressed on my chest, making it hard to breathe. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Paul sat next to me, silent but watchful, his presence steady but tense. I knew this was right, but I also knew it would destroy something in Steve, something I wasn't sure would ever heal. Inside the police station, everything felt sterile and distant. The smell of disinfectant and the cold, impersonal lighting made the place feel foreign, like I was stepping into a world where trust and warmth had no place. Paul took the lead, explaining everything with a calm precision that only seemed to heighten my anxiety. I stood by, nodding when needed, but mostly silent. The officer was sympathetic, but his words felt heavy. "We'll start the investigation, but these cases can take time, especially when family is involved." The ride home was even quieter, tension filling the space between us. Back at the house, Paul paced the living room, muttering to himself, frustration evident in every step. "This is going to tear Steve apart," he finally said, running a hand through his hair. I sat on the couch, staring blankly at the floor. "I didn't want it to come to this." "Deborah gave you no choice, Mom," Paul said, stopping to face me. "She stole from you." Before I could respond, the doorbell rang. My heart jolted, dread pulling in my stomach. Paul moved to the door, and when he opened it, there was Steve. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair a mess, and his eyes, red, haunted. He stepped in like a man walking to his own execution. "Mom," he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. I stood, my heart breaking at the sight of him. "Steve." He wouldn't meet my eyes, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry. You don't need to apologize for her," I said gently. This isn't your fault. Steve shook his head, tears threatening to fall. But it is. I should have seen it. I thought I could protect you. I stepped forward, taking his hands in mine. You tried, Steve. But Deborah. She made her choice. She spent it all, Steve said, his voice hollow. The money's gone, Mom. Everything you had. It's gone. The days after Steve's confession felt like wading through fog, each step heavy, my mind too clouded to see ahead. $570,000, gone. All the security I had built for my future, for my children's inheritance, vanished in the hands of someone I had trusted like a daughter. The house felt empty, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the betrayal, leaving me a stranger within them. Paul remained, his silent frustration a comfort. He knew when to speak and when to let the silence stretch between us, thick and loaded with unspoken words. Steve had disappeared into the wreckage of his marriage, swallowed by whatever threats and manipulations Deborah was surely hurling his way. But I knew one thing, there was no going back. The police were involved, and the reckoning was underway, dragging us with it, whether we were ready or not. It was Tuesday afternoon when the call came. I had been staring at the pile of unpaid bills on the counter when the phone rang, its sharp sound slicing through the silence. Paul, who had been pacing by the window, answered before I could move. "This is Paul Murphy," he said, his voice clipped. I watched as his face darkened, his posture stiffening as the detective's words sunk in. After a moment, he hung up, his jaw tight, his eyes locked onto mine. "They've arrested Deborah," he said quietly. Relief and guilt crashed over me, warring for dominance. I had wanted this, wanted justice, but now that it was real, it felt different. The mother of my grandchildren, in handcuffs. I hadn't pictured it like this. What happens now? My voice trembled. Paul crossed his arms, leaning against the counter. "They've got enough evidence. Security footage, bank records, it's airtight. She's going to be charged with theft and fraud, among other things." I nodded, though the room felt like it was spinning. "And Steve?" Paul's eyes softened, though his tone remained firm. "He'll have to testify. There's no way around it." A wave of nausea hit me. "This is going to destroy him," I whispered, feeling the weight of it all, the crushing guilt of a mother who couldn't protect her son. Paul sat beside me, his hand resting on my shoulder. "He's stronger than you think. He'll survive this, but you did what you had to. Deborah didn't leave you a choice." I nodded, but the guilt still gnawed at my insides. I had wanted to protect my family, not tear it apart. I never wanted it to end like this. "You're not tearing the family apart, Mom," Paul said softly. Deborah was. Now Steve can see that. The trial date loomed like a storm on the horizon, growing darker and more unavoidable by the day. Steve had moved out of the house he once shared with Deborah, now living in a small, grim apartment across town. The man who walked into court that day was barely recognizable, his once bright eyes now hollow, his body thin and hunched under the weight of his failure. He had filed for divorce, but Deborah fought for every penny, refusing to let go of what little power she had left. I sat beside Paul in the courtroom, the cold air buzzing with tension. Across the aisle, Steve slumped in his chair, staring at the floor. Deborah entered the room soon after, escorted by her lawyer. She looked different, thinner, her skin pale, but that familiar gleam of calculation still flickered in her eyes as she scanned the room. When her gaze met mine, she sneered, a venomous smirk that twisted my stomach. The trial was brutal. Evidence after evidence piled up, security footage, bank records, extravagant purchases made with my stolen money. Trips to Paris, a luxury car, designer clothes. It was all laid bare in front of us, a testament to how little she had cared for any of us. On the second day, Steve took the stand. He looked smaller up there, fragile. His hands trembled as he was sworn in, and I could see the weight of his guilt bearing down on him. "Mr. Murphy, can you describe your relationship with the defendant?" the prosecutor asked. Steve's voice cracked as he answered. "We were married for 7 years. We have 2 children. And during that time, were you aware of her spending habits? I knew she liked to spend, but I didn't realize how bad it had gotten. I trusted her, he said, his eyes flicking towards Deborah, who sat stone-faced, cold. And when you learned that your mother's life savings had been stolen, how did that make you feel? Steve took a breath, his voice thick with emotion. I felt like I'd been living a lie. That I didn't know the person I had married at all. The prosecutor nodded and moved on, but Steve's words echoed in the silence of the courtroom. I could see the betrayal etched into his face, the realization that everything he had believed in was a facade. When the verdict came, it was quick and final. Guilty on all counts. Deborah's sentence, 10 years in prison. As she was led away, she shot me one last look, her eyes blazing with hatred. But I didn't flinch. I had already lost everything she could take from me. Weeks after the trial, Steve showed up at my door, looking different. Lighter, as though a burden had finally been lifted. "Mom," he said, his voice hesitant. "Can I come in?" We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where everything had started. Silence filled the space between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes when 2 people have been through hell and survived. "Thank you," Steve said, breaking the quiet. "For everything. For doing what I couldn't." Tears welled in my eyes, but I smiled. "You don't have to thank me, Steve. I'm just glad you're okay." He nodded, his eyes full of a new kind of determination. "I'm going to start over. For me. For the kids. I've learned a lot from this." "You're stronger than you know," I whispered. In the months that followed, life slowly returned to something resembling normal. Steve got a new job and began rebuilding his life, and Paul remained my rock, steady and unwavering. I had lost my fortune, but I had regained something far more valuable. My family, stronger than before, with a deeper bond forged in the fires of betrayal and redemption. And for that, I found peace. If you like this story, please subscribe, like, click the bell, and leave a comment. Thank you in advance.